Australia has said it aims to cut its carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced the plan ahead of the UN climate conference, which begins on Sunday. But his government is not planning to bring in legislation to hit the 2050 target. Australia is one of the world's biggest coal and gas producers and has been under pressure to reduce emissions.
We know we can't let the changes that are happening around the world just happen to Australia. We know we can't pretend it's not happening, the changes that are occurring around the world, just as we haven't been pretending in the actions that both the government has been taking and, most importantly, Australians have been taking. Our plan is a fair plan. It's a practical plan. It's a responsible plan.
And from Canberra, I'm joined by Richie Merzian, the Climate and Energy Program Director at the Australia Institute. Richie, a very warm welcome to the show. A promise of net zero emissions by 2050, but with no plan to actually legislate it. How is that going to work?
Well, basically, the government has just promised the status quo, that Australia will continue to be one of the largest, it's the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world after Russia and Saudi Arabia, arguably the largest for coal, the largest for liquefied natural gas. The plan is to continue being a major fossil fuel producer and exporter, and to hope that technology and offsets will get Australia to net zero by 2050 without legislating, without having an immediate impact, and with having a number of loopholes within it. So it's not really much of a plan, and it's certainly nothing that the government wants to put on the floor of Parliament because it's unlikely to even pass if it does ever go there.
I think the world looks at Australia and its bushfires, at the damage to its coral reefs, and sees a country which stands a lot to lose from climate change. Why is this such a controversial topic in Australian politics?
Yeah, it is quite puzzling even for Australians. I mean, 7 out of 10 Australians want to see a net zero pathway that's strong and aligned with the Paris Agreement. And 6 out of 10 Australians want to see no more coal or gas or oil projects, new ones. You're right, like there was massive bushfires 2 years ago. There's been regular floods and droughts and extreme heat, and the Great Barrier Reef will go with more than 1.5 degrees of global warming. The problem is the Australian government has aligned its interests with the fossil fuel interests. In Australia, whilst fossil fuels are a major export, they don't provide a lot of jobs, they don't provide a lot of income, but they have a lot of political influence, particularly in some regional seats. And that's what's held Australia back for so many decades. The plan, the hope really, is that there's enough support, all the state governments in Australia, a lot of industry, and the majority of the public, according to the Australian Institute's Climate of the Nation, support stronger action. And the hope is that will be the case at the next federal election next year. In the meantime, unfortunately, we have more of the same, which is more fossil fuels. Because at the end of the day, net zero by 2050 that allows fossil fuels to flourish is a fraud.
Now, you personally have previously represented the Australian government at the UN Climate Change Conference. In your view, what needs to be done in order to achieve that goal of net zero?
The first thing to do would be to put a moratorium, a ban on any new coal or gas projects. Basically, you can't transition to a clean energy future if you're growing the problem. And much like in Germany, where a deal was negotiated to phase down coal, so too does that need to happen in Australia. Because Australia, the majority of its coal and gas go to China, Korea, and Japan. All three have net zero plans, which means that Australia's exports will eventually dwindle. The best thing to do now is to stop opening up new mines and start phasing down so that everyone is taken on that transition plan rather than disrupted. The second thing is to actually set targets. 100% renewable energy this decade, 100% clean cars, clean electric cars, because Australia is at the back of the pack on clean vehicles, moving off gas for heating, and then also looking at how you transition the agricultural sector. All those technologies are possible. What's missing is the political will.
All right, Richie Merzian from the Australia Institute, thank you very much for joining us on the show.
My pleasure.
And I'm now joined from Sydney by the journalist Roger Maynard. It's good to see you, Roger. So the target's been set, a promise of net zero by 2050. But has the Australian government given details as to how that's going to happen?
Well, yes, to a certain extent. At the moment, they call it a plan, but it was a little lacking on details when the Prime Minister made the announcement earlier today. Certainly, the Prime Minister's critics thought so, with the Greens calling it a con, and the Labour opposition describing it all as all marketing, with no details of how it will be funded. But clearly, this is a big step for the Conservative coalition government here, which has resisted demands for net zero emissions in the past. But 2050 is the promise, now that the federal government has got its junior coalition partner, the National Party, on board. The Nationals, who represent many of those regional areas which could be most affected by the closure of coal mines and the like, and the extra financial burdens placed on agriculture, has now decided to support the government's new climate policy, which will enable Prime Minister Scott Morrison to go to COP26 in Glasgow with his head held high. In return, the government has pledged to protect Australia during the transition period over the next 3 decades. The Prime Minister called it a whole-of-economy plan, one involving technology, not taxes, and he said it would rely heavily on low-emissions technology, solar energy, hydrogen and carbon offsets, as well as carbon capture and storage. Christine.
Roger, tell us why this has been such a controversial topic in Australia when other developed countries have already accepted the need to take decisive action on emissions and the use of fossil fuels.
Well, that's partly because coal is such big business here and is currently enjoying record prices. It's Australia's second largest export industry and is worth about $50 billion a year. It also employs 50,000 people or more, generates more than half of the country's energy supplies. So a lot is at stake in terms of jobs and exports. The downside, of course, is the impact on global warming caused by coal-fired power stations, and in particular, the natural disasters associated with higher temperatures. You'll remember the catastrophic Australian bushfires of a couple of years ago, which were preceded by a severe drought. And carbon emissions are also believed responsible for warmer sea temperatures, which have been partly blamed for damage to the Great Barrier Reef, one of this country's most sensitive ecosystems. So there's a lot at stake here, not only for Australia, but of course for the planet as a whole.
All right, that's the journalist Roger Maynard talking to us from Sydney. Thank you, Roger, as always.